So welcome to all of you to our Tips for R01 Success, Informed Perspectives from Study Section Reviewers. I'm Lauren Pecorello. I'm the Senior Associate Dean for Faculty Wellbeing and Development. And this presentation today is sponsored by the Office of Faculty Development. Next slide. So just a very quick reminder of who we are. The mission of the OFD is to support all faculty as they develop through each stage of their scientific, clinical, and educational and administrative careers. And we are committed to helping create an equitable, just, and inclusive culture that cultivates the well-being and professional fulfillment of all faculty. And the way we do that is using these three pillars of career advancement, mentorship enrichment, and leadership development. And sort of the external circle around it is really our values and what we aim to focus on in each of these pillars. And so today we're really talking about career advancement largely, specifically for our scientists here at Mount Sinai. Next slide. So just a little housekeeping. This is how this session is going to go. So after the event, probably not immediately after, but in a week or two after the event, the recording will be shared. Initially, pre-submitted questions will be answered first during the panel discussion. That will probably be the first half of the panel. And then we encourage you to utilize the Q&A feature to ask questions in real time. We will do our best to answer as many of those questions as possible. Some of them will be answered via written responses, and some of them I will ask to the panel in the second half of the discussion. If for some reason your question does not get answered and you really have the burning question, you can always email the OFD and we can forward it on to our experts and get the answer for you. Next slide. So I'm very thankful to today's panelists. I'm just going to very briefly name them, and then I'm going to have them actually introduce themselves. So Dr. Amelia Bacciella, who is the Vice Chair for Mentoring, Education, and Population Health Sciences and Policy, and also the Director for the Center for Biostatistics. Kirk Campbell, who's a Vice Chair for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Department of Medicine, and also a professor in that department. Dr. Yasmin Hurd, the Director of the Addiction Institute of Mount Sinai and a professor in psychiatry and neuroscience and pharmacological sciences. And Dr. Rosalind Wright, who's the Dean for Translational Biomedical Research and a professor in pediatrics, environmental medicine, and medicine, pulmonary, and critical care. So thank you all for joining us. I'll just go around the room, starting with Dr. Bacciella.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel. So I am a biostatistician. For more context in this particular panel, I have been a member of several study sections for the past probably 20 to 25 years at the NIH, at the VA, at the CDC, and other study sections outside the United States. I was a member of a standing study section at NINDS for a very long time, and I have graduated from that study section a couple of years ago, but I still serve as an ad hoc member of other study sections.
Thank you. Dr. Wright?
Hi, everyone. Roz Wright. So I've also served on a number of NIH study sections for over the last more than 2 decades. Most of my research is in epidemiology and embedded in long-standing cohort studies, longitudinal cohort studies. So my participation has really been through the research or the review branch of epidemiology and population health at NIH, and the study sections I was a standing member on included behavioral medicine, intervention and outcomes, which has been changed to biobehavioral medicine and health outcomes. And then I was on IRAP for 6 years, including as chair, which is it was kind of a wastebasket, infectious disease, reproductive health, asthma, and pulmonary disorders. And that's now been divided, as it should have been, into 3 different study sections that focus each of those areas. I also served on a number of special emphasis panels to review conflict applications for those study sections, as well as just special program projects that go on, and also internationally as well. So any of those I have some experience in.
Thank you. Dr. Campbell.
Hi, everyone. Really nice to be on this panel. And I'm a physician scientist in the division of nephrology. So I do basic clinical and translational research in that space. So the study sections I've been on reflect that interest. More recently, I've been a standing member on the pathobiology of kidney disease study section. And I've also done ad hoc work as similar to a lot of my co-panelists on Career Development Award panels, drug discovery panels, nationally and internationally. So really happy to share some thoughts with you today.
Thank you, Dr. Hurd.
Yes, hi. So like everybody else, the reason that we're all here is that we've had the experiences of serving on study sections. Like the others, I've been there for indeed a couple of decades on both standing and special emphasis panels, and I've chaired standing study sections for many years, mainly dealing with mental disorders and addiction. I've also been on the advisory council for the NIH CSR, the Center for Scientific Review, that coordinates all of the grants. So I'm happy to be part of the panel and provide any insights that can help you.
Thank you so much. And just to orient the participants today, what I'm going to do is ask each question to one of the panelists to give sort of a sort of longer answer. And then I'll ask each of the other panelists to add any thoughts they have. And that will sort of go around round robin. So each panelist will get to answer fully in sort of that fashion. So I'll start with you, Dr. Bagiela, with question number 1. So I'll read out the question. Do R01s need to have a data collection aspect to them? In other words, can an R01 be based on analyzing existing data and running assays on previously collected biospecimens? And then there's sort of a follow-up question to that is sort of how much data is needed?
So the short answer is yes. So the R01 is not, unless you're responding to a particular RFA, the R01 does not have a requirement of producing data. It could be based on data that already exists, that need to be analyzed on specimen, that needs to be analyzed and on existing cohorts that are already running and for which there are already results there. So the collection of data is not a requirement for an R01. However, I believe that everyone knows that starting January, the NIH has imposed the data management plans, and they need to be very well detailed when applying for the R01. So whether you're using existing data or whether you're using data that is being collected as part of the R01, the data management plan needs to be detailed at the time of the application.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bagiela. Would anyone else like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would. This is Roz again. I would say I've made a career over using extant data and leveraging biorepositories to do mechanistic work. And not only I've made a career, we see that as an important resource for junior faculty to leverage and use. So absolutely, I think what I would say I learned along the way is when I had a mechanism in there, and the importance of a biorepository in that context has been, like liquid gold to us. And it's interesting, right? You want to explore and expand these mechanisms. Another way we've taken advantage of it, say a new methodology comes along, an analytic advancement, where you can now look at, not one pollutant at a time, but many pollutants at a time, or do that. New science is always coming, so there's always ways to think about doing that.
Please go ahead.
I can also add in terms of genetics, today, the NIH, there are a lot of consortia with a lot of data, and genetics is a big part. And as Ross mentioned, Dr. Wright mentioned, for junior investigators, it's really a great thing that you have all of these repositories, you have all these huge databases. that helps you to even develop the hypotheses, and that there are so many new ways of so many new analytical ways. So that's where, you know, NIH wants repurposing of a lot of data that's out there, and you should absolutely leverage it more and more. And like I said, genetics is another big way in which you can use a lot of data that's already there.
Yeah, and I would just certainly emphasize, I know there's some questions around feasibility and how you leverage feasibility with an innovative aspect to a grant. And this is one way where you can have a very feasible project, right? The samples already collected and banked, and you can still really address highly innovative, transformative ideas. And as Dr. Hurd said as well, the NIH has invested a lot in existing biorepositories, and they want them to be used. So it will look highly favorable for you to leverage existing resources in that way.
But to Amelia's or Dr. Begiela's point, this new data sharing plan, you need to make sure you can share that data, right? You need to, if you're utilizing another resource, you need to do the work, the legwork to understand what can be shared, how best to share it, talk to, you know, that's a new layer for sure. And we're all figuring that out as we go forward.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go to Dr. Hurd next for the next question. How do you strike a balance between framing your project as, on one hand, highly innovative and groundbreaking and potentially higher risk, and on the other hand, feasible, having a high chance of success due to a rock solid approach, maybe less groundbreaking?
Right. I think that's the challenge for everyone, as you said, you know, in terms of this balance. And I'm going to come back again, perhaps to the more junior people, because obviously this is more probably targeted for their career development. I think that, you know, when we talk about innovation is not just in the, you know, you don't have to have original data, for example. We just mentioned in terms of new, you know, analytical tools that are out there can be innovative. The question you're asking could be innovative. A lot of times people think that they have to like jump over the moon, you know, 360-degree tumbles and so on to be quote unquote be innovative. The questions you're asking can be innovative, but at the end of the day, it's really about feasibility. And I think when you are, you know, a junior investigator, it's important to have other people read your application early enough for them to see if you have that balance. And if you propose that you're going to do 20 billion things, that's going to be much more detrimental, the feasibility, than it is to say, oh, you're not innovative enough. We still want fundamental research to be done. So not everything has to be, you know, highly innovative in the context of that, you know, you have to be in Nature, Science, or whatever your top journals for your field, but you definitely need to really, I think for the most part, focus on the feasibility, and you can put aspects of how it will impact on your field, and especially on a clinical level. I think there's a lot there that people, you know, we need to improve, especially translational. How do we translate all this? So I always err more on the side of improving feasibility, and you know, you can finesse innovation.
I would add that I think that there are the two issues are completely separate in some sense. I have seen applications that are you know, overambitious in some sense, and that how the application will score in the end is overambitious. You're trying to go to the moon when you don't have the means to go right across the street. So that type of grant gets penalized in some way. A grant can be, or an application can be extremely innovative and at the same time extremely simple. And you can go for the simple, crisp, very clear aims, very novel ideas without being overambitious.
Yeah, I think I would agree with everything that's just been said, but one thing I do as a mentor, particularly for junior faculty, we all make the mistake. We want to promise everything. My job is to rake it out and say, this is enough. This is really enough. Let's write this well. If I'm doing something innovative, pushing the envelope, and you can run into that, right? Too innovative, you fall over that, whatever that line is, depending on the study section. I tend to really pay attention to the preliminary data I put in there to make sure I have supported each thing. Not that I've done it already. You got to be a little careful. You can't, but to say, you know what, I'm getting signal for each of these things that I'm going to do. And sometimes that'll help me sift out what maybe we shouldn't go there because we don't have, and this is an R01, so they're going to want to see preliminary data. They're going to look at feasibility, the likelihood of success, that kind of thing. So you do need it for that. So I just add that, I think.
Yeah, and I would just say as well, definitely agree with everything that was said. But with innovation, it can be conceptual or technical. And I think you also have to have a feasible proposal, but you don't have to develop new methodology to satisfy the technical innovation characteristics. You can, apply state of the art, approaches that have not been used to solve a particular problem that you're addressing, for example. So you don't have to necessarily go too far outside the comfort zone, right, of the capabilities. You don't want to do this, especially for the standard R01. There are high risk, high reward RFAs out there, but for the R01, definitely make sure that there's strong feasibility.
Oh, one thing I would add, your population may be your innovation. Hasn't been done before. We've used that one a lot. For health disparities, for nobody's done this in adolescence, we need to understand this life stage. It can be as simple as that, just back to what Dr. Bagdale and Dr. Hurd were saying as well. Simple.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask this of Dr. Campbell. Can you talk to us about the process of engaging with program officers? Timeline, aims, drafts, and sort of what they can provide along the way.
Yeah, this is something that I didn't do enough of earlier in my career, and realized a lot of my colleagues were leveraging this path a lot more successfully. So the program officers can be truly valuable in steering you towards specific program announcements, RFAs that you may not even know about. And that happened with our group quite recently. They will look over specific aims drafts and provide some general advice. Again, with the caveat that they're not the ones who are going to be ultimately reviewing the grant. So, you do still have to use your own judgment, but I think the advice they can provide before you've even finished completing the grant, and you want to do this as you're in that early conceptualization phase, I'd say is when they're most helpful. And of course, after the study section has met and you've gotten your comments back and your score, if you have questions about next steps, likelihood of funding, resubmissions, the program officers again can provide very useful guidance for you as you plot resubmissions or next steps.
I can also add that from my career, I can say the program officers that I had in the early stage of my career were amazing. They really were like one of my biggest supporters. Like, when you didn't get that grant, they gave just so much input because they were in the room when the discussions were being made. Now, obviously, sometimes it's virtual, but they can't participate in the actual discussions and study sections, but they are there and they can hear, and sometimes certain things that may not be written in a certain way, they can articulate it to you in terms of what really are the key things to focus on. But I always tell my mentees from the beginning that you start putting together your specific aims. Once you have that, it is important to start developing that relationship with your program officer. But I will say that not all program officers are great. I also have had a lot of people who have had really bad program officers, but I think you should still make sure to maintain a relationship with them. And sometimes it doesn't happen often. We've had it happen a few times where a grant did well in study section, but the institute won't fund it. And a program officer will tell you early on if what you're proposing, their institute is not going to back. And so that's another reason why, getting early input from a program officer is helpful.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I agree. I really have nothing to add to those statements. That's what I would have said too.
All right, Roz, so this question's for you to start. In your experience, in which sections of the proposal do you give the most critical feedback?
When I'm the reviewer?
Yes.
Well, you know, I look very carefully at the approach, but if you lose me in the background where you're justifying why, you've lost me. I really do read that very carefully. That's easier for me if it's in my wheelhouse, like pulmonary or, you know, certain areas, but I have to, I'll read it very carefully, you know, because I think that's our responsibility as reviewers. I mean, to get the best science. If that's underdeveloped, if you haven't justified why, and you haven't sold it, they used to tell me when I was learning to write grants, if they're not singing the Star Spangled Banner and waving the flag by the time you've gotten to where in saying this has got to be done, and they're the only ones that can do it, you haven't written that part very well. And when you're reading 10, 12 grants as a reviewer, I'll tell you, I won't help you. You know, you have to take me by the hand. So I would say that is very important. I would guess that's the critical part. And then you see if you find holes in the approach.
I'm a statistician, and my role on the study section is mostly to, you know, make sure that the design is appropriate, that the sample size is justified, and that the statistical analysis section is well detailed. So, and I would say that more and more study sections include not just one, but 2, 3, 4, or 5 statisticians. So the NIH especially pays a lot of attention to the rigor of the design and the sample size calculations and the statistical analysis. So my recommendation is that you have a good relationship with the statistician if you're not yourself a statistician, and you have a very strong analytical section in your grant. And don't forget to say that you have a statistician on board, because we pick on that.
That has definitely been a trend over the 2 decades or more I've been on study section, is that more weight is giving to rigor and the design and the statistical approach and power, for sure. That has to be, I don't mean to say no, they said pick one. And the other thing is you have 3 reviewers or more assigned to this application. I always take it as, what can I bring? What's my expertise? I want to be sure I get that out there and make sure I'm a voice in the room for that application. I'm not a statistician. I understand study design and statistics, but I do listen more to my colleagues as I'm listening to them in the room. And I'll say, oh, I didn't notice that was a problem. You know, that's why you have these discussions with broad expertise. But you're right. The biostatistics has become more important, and we've had many more statisticians on study sections in my experience, which is good.
Yeah, it's funny. So I was on the CSR and rewriting. So they're going to have new guidelines for reviewing grants. And Ross, to your point, a major thing is this important? Do you get the, you know, from the beginning, even if you have every study design is great, but it's not important that you haven't gotten them from the beginning. And can this be done? So it comes back to feasibility, and can this be done well? And that's where, you know, the statistical design comes in. So if you frame your questions in that simple way, those are the things, you know, those 3 things really lead you through. And also, can this be done well by this particular group? And that comes in with a team you bring on board to conduct your research, which includes statisticians if you're not a statistician. But definitely for me, I agree with Roz, if I can't understand why they're doing this, if it's not significant, even if it's, you know, the approach looks okay and so on, remember, think about you having a limited amount of money, and you're trying to do, you know, to support research. If you think about it in that way, if the research you're proposing is not important, is not significant to really move the dial in terms of medicine, well, and I mean, different things, and even obviously depends on what your research is, and, you know, basic science. you're not going to get that grant. So I really think that that's one of the things that, you know, really must think about the balance of it, but the beginning and the end should be equally tight. So why am I doing this? And can it be done well with the design I have?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, a lot of us are saying the significance is sort of a major score driving factor. And this is true. I mean, the approach, I think, gets a lot of critical feedback, but a major score driving element is the significance, because if the approach is perfect, but as my colleagues are saying, the grant is not significant in transforming the field, adding new knowledge or advancing current evidence that's currently out there, it's not going to likely be in the fundable range. So I think that that's really a key point to drive home.
And if I could, I want to add, because you know, I read the significance, but again, I'm a statistician. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a biologist. So sometimes my understanding is not extremely good. But you have to write it so that I can understand it as well. Is very, very important, that I don't get hung up on you know, concepts that are so far so difficult that I cannot grasp what you're trying to say. One other thing is that our program officer in our study section pointed out every time was the fact that you haven't identified a population that for which there is no cure, for example, makes your application important. But still, you need to be able to answer a question. So the fact that you say, you know, there is no cure for this disease, so whatever I do, I will improve the field, that is not necessarily true. You really have to have your background, your premises, the scientific premises, very, very strong, so that you can build on that.
Thank you so much. I think this might be a quick question. I'll start with Dr. Baggiella. So when do you need a letter of support?
You need a letter of support. So usually you don't ask a letter of support to your MPI or your co-PIs, right? So those are part of your grant. You ask a letter of support from a senior person who provides expertise to you. You ask a letter of support from a lab that is essential for your research. You ask a letter of support from a particular group that is going to support you. And the study section need to get a very strong sense that, you know, you have this wonderful idea and you're answering a very important question, but then you don't have a lab who does your essays, for example.
And they also have this new category, other significant contributor, and we get letters of support from those folks because they're not going to be on the budget. You know, they don't get support, but then how are they feasibly got time to be contributing? Why is that make sense, that role for that person, that kind of thing. And the other thing about labs, if you use an international lab, you have to justify why you're not doing it with a U.S. lab. And there are ways that that can be written in the letter of support as well.
All right, I'm going to move on to the next one. And this is about after you've had an R01, what is some advice for either renewal or for getting your second R01? What are some sort of general potential rules of thumb to help you with that?
Who did you direct that to?
I'm sorry, that's to Dr. Hurd.
Oh, all right. Okay. Yeah. So, you know, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I mean, at the end of the day, today, in being able to run a highly successful lab, it's difficult to just run it on one R01. So, but I'm not telling, you know, early stage investigators, you really need to get your foundation of your lab going. So with that first R01, make sure you are working towards fulfilling what you have proposed in that grant, because that's going to give you then the competitive renewal. Trust me, 5 years go by really quickly. you know, and in fact, it's 4 years because you start putting together, you know, your data to substantiate the continuing, the competitive renewal application, and you don't want it to run out. So you're going to be submitting like within year 4, so that you have time perhaps to go back and forth with the study section that you have to submit twice in order to get it. So I really think that you really need to make sure that you accomplish the things that you set out to accomplish in that first R01. Often you start seeing new things and getting new data that opens up a new line of research. And for me, that's when you start thinking, okay, let me start putting together a second R01. Because as I said, unfortunately, everything is getting more and more expensive today, from students to postdocs to, you know, the assays and the statisticians we work with. Everything is more expensive. So it's important to try to get a second R01. And as I said, you can use a lot of the data that you're generating that may open up some new lines of questions that it's not really appropriate for the current grant that you have, but it lends itself very well because now you have preliminary data for that second grant. And to me, I definitely think by year 3, people should start even thinking about submitting a second R01, or, you know, earlier, obviously, depending on the work that they get. But I think today's research, today's science, you need like 2 R01s to be, to maintain, you know, stability. And indeed, suppose you lose that first one, you at least have a second one there until you can get back that first, you might have to resubmit a number of times to get back that first grant.
For me, I think whether you're going to do an unsolicited R01 that takes a new path from what your original scope might have been versus a competitive renewal. So for example, I do population-based research. So early in my career, I was establishing cohorts. So you don't get anything done in 5 years. You don't get any papers out except reviews and those kinds of things. You're just collecting the data, establishing the cohort, getting enough follow-up where you start to have outcomes to look at. So I did not write competitive renewals early. I wrote other grants to just what Dr. Hurd has been saying. And I absolutely think you got to start in year 3. If I have a K mentee, they're writing their R01 in year 3, no later. We might start talking about it even sooner, and they think I'm nuts because they think, hey, I just got this. I got 5 years, but it creeps up on you. And you do have to have more than one as you build a team. You want your team, right? You want to build your research program. So it is the way that it has to go. I think in my whole career, I've written 1 competitive renewal. And I'll have to say, I always am looking and beating the bushes for the RFAs, because you either get it or you don't. You don't have to go through 2 cycles. And fortunately, early in my career, there were some nice ones that were there. So do always look for those opportunities as well. And you just got to be always searching for those.
Yeah, I do have some colleagues who have traditionally gone for new R01s rather than renewing existing ones, even though I guess statistically the renewals have a better chance of being funded. But it does depend on the progress report. So I think, you know, this is where, again, talking with the program officer, individualized decision making based on your own research program. And just recognizing that you know, biomedical research is not static. As you acquire new knowledge, new, you know, mouse models, you know, become aware of new cohorts, you know, you will get these creative juices flowing, and time can be of the essence, right? So you may be driven by those considerations, you know, other than, you know, your preset timeline of when you may want to renew your existing R. An opportunity may just arise where you want to submit a new R01 in the second year, for example, of your current. It just really depends on your specific science. And again, talking with your collaborators and the program officer.
And I would say that if you're going for a renewal, you need really to come up with very original way to write your hypothesis. I haven't seen grants that are renewed just on the basis that we don't have time to finish what we started, be funded very quickly, right? So if you have a clinical trial, for example, you know, you finish the clinical trial, that's the end of the road. Then you think about a new idea, maybe another clinical trial. if you are in a renewal mode, you need to have very, very novel ideas for what you were doing and build on those ideas. And as Ross was saying before, the cohort, building a cohort gives the ability to ask new novel questions from the cohort that you have. I don't see a renewal in many other contexts, honestly.
Thanks so much. So this is the last question I'm going to ask from our set questions, although some of the ones in the chat are similar, so I may combine a few. But Dr. Wright, I'm going to ask you this one. So how do you know when it is time to change to a different study section? In other words, your score is improving, but you're not getting funded in the study section. Or maybe it's not improving. When do you switch? Sorry, that was for you, Dr. Wright.
Oh, sorry. Well, I am selective. I do think about where to put them based on knowing, the makeup of the roster for the review committee. I've made decisions about where to send applications. And I did tell you I was on IRAP for 6 years. Some of my early grants were on asthma research and lung growth and development. And I never got to go to IRAP because I was on IRAP. So it always went to a special emphasis panel. And I had mixed experiences with the special emphasis panel, depending on who they pulled together to review those, et cetera. And I felt like I had a better chance in certain standing study sections. So, depending on what our aims were, we were selective about pushing those grants maybe based on the exposure we were looking at or the particular outcome we'd look at. So we thought we had a better chance of getting funded. A lot of that was driven by my knowing people. As you get to know more people in your network and you understand and you sit on some of these as a visitor and you see the study section working and you like it. I've used that. This is another place where you might reach out to your program officer as well and have that conversation.
Yeah, I could also add, I think for me, you really need to step back. And I know it's difficult, and especially when you're disappointed you didn't get, the grant in a fundable score for many times. You have to step back and say, is it really the study section or is it the grant? Is it the, coming back to what we talked about earlier, is this really interesting? Is the experimental design something that is not really, rigorous enough? And really giving it to other people even to read. And as Ross just said, giving it to your, having a really frank discussion with your program officer can really help you to see whether or not it's the study section or whether it is the grant. If it comes back to the study section may not be appropriate for the work that you are doing because of the expertise on that study section is not there. That's one thing also the program officer can help give you guidance. But sometimes it's difficult for us. We always think that everything that we write is great, and it's important to step back and to figure out what really is the problem. Is it the study section? And then you really look into what aspect of the study section is maybe off in terms of, is it a technical thing? Is it that the statistics thing? Is it the model that you're using that they're not getting? But either way, I think the program officer can help you.
And be aware that when you get the reviews back at the end of the PDF, there is always the study section roster. So you can look at that. You have the right to look at who was on the study section. You will not know, obviously, who reviewed your application because that is anonymous. But you know who is on the study section, and there are titles, there are the schools where they come from, the institution where they come from. So you get a sense of whether that study section had the expertise to actually review your grant. One other thing that I just learned, very recently talking to the program officer we have a lot of discussions, is that the NIH receives these days tons of applications, and they cannot honor every request for, I want to go to that study section, I want to go to the other study section, this is the reviewers that I want, and this is the reviewers that I don't want. And so they have a matchmaker engine where they enter the abstract of your grants, and the engine spits out the most suitable study section for that abstract. So one thing that you need to pay attention to is that abstract. Make sure that the keywords of what you're doing are in that abstract, because that is a big part of where your grant is going to end up, into what study session your grant is going to end up.
I agree with that, but I also, the other thing you can do, and I've been advised to do over the years from program, is to write in your cover letter. This is my grant. I've selected the title, so the keywords are right in the title, honestly, and the abstract for sure. But I also say this grant requires X, Y, and Z expertise, and I also may in there request a certain study section. I don't know that I've ever said no to a reviewer or yes to, I didn't recommend or anything like that. But that helps the SROs, right? Make sure that they have you're helping them in a way. And I learned this when I was on study section. I had a great SRO who now runs the research branch that most of my grants go to. But she was fantastic, and she advised that, and she said that was used, and most of my grants have gone to where I've asked, and that, I think that's been helpful, and I do feel I get the reasonable expertise on the panel. So a letter can help as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say that as well. I agree with Dr. Wright. The letters can help, and you can certainly specify what expertise is required. And just a thing to note about study sections, they have standing members, but they also have a lot of ad hoc members who are invited to each review meeting. And oftentimes, if the standing membership doesn't have the expertise that's required for your particular grant, they can call in some ad hoc reviewers to help review specific grants. So this is why it's important in the cover letter to really make those details clear.
And I'll just add one quick thing to what everyone said. So when your grant is given a study is sent to study section, they send you an email, and so you know immediately. I have made an error, and I've actually had one grant of mine go to a wrong study section because I completely didn't even look at what study section it went to, because I thought, oh, they know me. My abstract was great in terms of and it went to a really weird study section, and I didn't catch it in time. So make sure you open up, go into NIH Commons when you get that email that it's now been assigned, and just double check that indeed it's appropriate. You could have an opportunity then even to reach out to CSR and have, they can take a look and see, whether or not it is possible to move it. But at early stage of assignment is when you can make any changes. After that, no.
So that was just a follow-up question.
Time is of the essence.
Yeah, that was the follow-up question, is how do you actually get your application assigned to a different study section, either in the beginning or if you're just having a lot of failures going forward? How do you do that? And anyone can answer.
As Dr. Wright said, in the cover letter, you can be very clear. And also they do in the application within Sinai, when you put it, you actually put in, there's a slot for which study section you would prefer to go to. Doesn't mean that it goes there necessarily, but the earlier the better, and in the cover letter.
And I think that there is, writing an R01, especially if it is the first R01, is a lot of homework that you have to do. Really a lot of homework in the background. And one of the homework that you might want to do is to go to the NIH website, get the list of all study sections, and really learn which ones are the closest to the work that you do. Who are the members of those study sections, and learn, which one is the one for you. And again, when you receive the email that says your grant has been assigned to this study section, make sure that that study section is the right one for you. And if not, you really have a small window of time where you can contact the SRO and say, hey, I'm concerned. I don't think that that is the right study section. And, you know, they may or might not reassign it, but most of the time they do listen to you. If you wait until the, right, the process is already unfolding, they're not going to change your grant to another study section once it's already sent to the reviewers.
Mhm.
So I'm gonna, thank you so much. I'm gonna move on because we have a couple questions in the chat I want to make sure we get to. So the first one is to talk about the pros and cons of applying for a grant as an MPI versus a PI early on in your career. And I'm gonna open that up to whoever wants to jump into that one.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, that's certainly a great question. And I think in the early career stage, obviously there are advantages to having the early career investigator status, right, for a number of institutes. And just to be clear, if you're going in as an MPI, if all the PIs don't have that early stage status, you lose it, right? So I think that's certainly something to be well aware of. On the contrary, you know, if there's unique expertise that's complementary among the MPI team that you really need to go in this way, then you may have to do it. And we've seen where grants have been funded, right, to early career investigators going in as an MPI with somebody more senior who really just has a clear complementary skill set and just really fits well. So that's a very strategic decision, driven a lot by science, but also being well aware of the early career status.
All right, I'm going to pop into the next question so we can get these taken care of. So this is specific to microbiome and multiomics. So for epidemiology study involving microbiome and multiomics, what is the best way to show biological plausibility, as well as the innovative biostatistical and bioinformatics analysis, such as machine learning, et cetera?
And this
I
is
can
specifically
answer.
to look at
Yeah.
multi-omics,
Yes,
to do integrated omics. Okay.
yes.
Go
So
ahead.
I can answer part of the question, and that is the question on the statistical analysis. So there is a lot that is out there in terms of machine learning, artificial intelligence, convolutions, network, and you know, all that. What I suggest is be as clear as possible. When we reviewer look at these black boxes where you know, just describe a model that we have no idea what goes in, what comes out, that are not clear to us, that is overly complicated, that is not going to do you a favor. Always, I mean, this is the rule of the applications, not just the R01. Be as simple as possible. Think about that. The people who read your grant don't have your same expertise on what you're writing. You are the one who has the expertise because you had the idea and you're proposing that idea. So when we see these very elaborated, you know, statistical analysis plans with all this modeling, and in the end, we don't understand what you exactly are doing, that is just, you know, just there we lose you. And you don't get a good score on that application.
Thank you.
And
So I'm
I
going
think
to go ahead. Go ahead. If you have a quick response, go ahead.
Oh, if I would write that as, what do we know from the single omics, perhaps even more targeted biological pathways that might be operating, and then build it on that, right? Why do you get more information by going across platforms? That's biology to me. So just again, start with the simple and take them by the hand and say, you know, we understand now we can gain more by doing this, and then there's these tools, etc. But I agree with Dr. Bagielli. If it's not clear what's going in and what's coming out, and you just laundry list of all this stuff you have just to wow people, that's not going to do it.
So let me give this next question to Dr. Campbell and Dr. Hurd to answer. So for multidisciplinary projects, how do we decide which agent or section to submit to? For example, outcomes involving nutrition, digestive disease, and cancer. You know, how do you figure out what bucket it goes into?
Yeah, I guess I'll start off, you know, again, it comes back to the discussion around which study section, right? Specifically, even more so than institute. And you know, that'll require a lot of homework and talking to the program officers and looking to see what expertise is available on individual study sections within those respective institutes, because it can certainly make a big difference in terms of funding policies. So this is where, again, engagement with a program officer before the grant submitted is crucially important. And there are publicly available lists, right, of the different study sections across institutes that you can look through to see what their focus is, what the standing membership is like, and their expertise. Really important before submitting.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add, coming back to one thing I mentioned earlier about certain institutes may or may not be interested in it. And so that's where the program officer can also help to say whether or not that institute would be open. But another thing that people don't realize is that actually institutes actually share funding a grant. So you can choose, like, you know, the first institute it goes to, again, in your application submission, and the second, you can even choose, you know, the institutes. Often then when you're speaking to program officers, and you can speak to a program officer associated with different institutes, they even do this cost sharing. And so it's not a bad thing to have these multidisciplinary projects. That's biology, that's life. And some of the institutes are very happy to cost share some of the projects. So it's not a bad thing. Again, it comes back to what's the main focus of the project? And if it's a really truly integrative, you can get that insight from the program officers from the different institutes.
So I have, I think, one more question that I can ask, which is it's a long question, so just give me a moment to read it. So significance is somewhat subjective, with trends shifting priorities over time. If grant reviews prioritize significance, what does this mean for people working in unpopular research areas? Referring here to findings noted in Hope et al., topic choices contribute to the lower rate of NIH awards to African American Black scientists. How should PIs and research institutions address these challenges faced by PIs working in these unpopular but still very important research areas? Obviously, we can't encourage scientists to work in more popular areas when, you know, their research is important. So what are your thoughts?
So I will say a lot of the research that I did when I first started was considered, and not in the sense of it was considered quote unquote unpopular. People even told me, for example, some of the work I did with cannabis. Cannabis is not an addictive drug. Why are you even studying it? Why are you trying to study the human brain in this respect? You know, I got a lot of pushback. I still think that there's a difference between if something is unpopular and how you make the significance relevant to the people reading that application. A lot of times the people will, you know, I think this comes back to the message, and you can emphasize the importance of this. And especially today, actually, because of the Hope paper and a number of other papers, and indeed NIH itself doing the statistics to show the bias. And I would, you know, even emphasize there's such bias in regard to studying this important topic, even if it might not be, you know, in the headlines of Science and Nature and so on, those journals. And I think it's how it is written. We don't want to force people. That's a great thing about science that I love. The diversity of scientists and the questions that, you know, look at all of us, we're asking different questions and we're all successful. That's the thing. We came into this field for a reason. You want to still continue to study the thing that you find most interesting and that you want to have impact on, but it's how it's written to make sure that that significance and that importance really resonates with those who are reading it.
Does anyone else want to add anything to that question?
I think the more successful grants you can get your eyes on and see how people have made that argument, underscored the significance in different contexts and different areas of science is a great idea. Use your mentors' eyes and others, seasoned reviewers and writers, grant writers, to look at it and help direct you to how you might shape that significance. Lots of people have great ideas and great grants, but there's a way to write them. Writing a grant is different than a manuscript, and there's grantsmanship that many of us have learned along the way. So take advantage of that.
Yeah. I was just gonna say as well. I definitely agree. I mean, you have control over what's documented in that significant section, so it's really making the case as to why this work is important. And I think on the other side, the reviewer side, NIH is obviously trying to take a lot of steps, right, to diminish any bias on the part of reviewers, and that's also important work that has to happen. But I think the two aren't exclusive. They need to certainly both occur.
I think that, this is also part of the homework that needs to be done. And again, it's a lot of homework. Whenever you're submitting an application, make sure that, the topic, the questions that you submit align with the mission of the institute to which you're submitting. The idea could be a very good idea, but if that institute is not interested in that particular topic, whether it's popular or unpopular, it might be reviewed well, but then, as Yasmin said before, it's going to go to council and is not going to pass that because it's not part of what the institute wants to push forward.
So we are up at 2 more minutes left. What I'd like to do is just ask you each to say 30 seconds of what your sort of, what advice either you would give to one of your mentees applying right now for their first R01, what sort of one sentence, or the advice you wish you got when you were applying for your first R01. You can start, Amelia, if you would like to.
Okay, well, sure. Again, I think that the advice that I give to my mentees when they apply to their R01 is be simple, be crisp, be clear. That is the way that you buy a ticket into the study section. Don't be over ambitious, don't be over complicated. Complications are not what reviewers like. If I cannot follow the application and I cannot understand what you're doing, you have lost me. And that is also in the writing, right? Make the application pleasant to the eyes, because we read a lot of applications. So, the bold, the red, the white, the green, be careful with that. Make sure that your application is pleasant.
Dr. Wright.
Start early. You're going to have a lot of drafts. Get as many eyes on it as you possibly can. Put it through, do the CTSA supported Reach for Your R01 mock study sections. Take advantage of those things. Look at successful grants, how people have written it. The first thing I do in my mentees, we have a repository of successful grants, including revisions, etc. And something that's more in line with what they're doing. Take a look at this. Take a look at things I've written that might be helpful. But mostly it's, let's set out a timeline, because there's a lot of moving parts here that you're going to have to understand, including the writing piece that you have to do, and have a schedule of when you're going to show something. If I'm the person helping them shepherd it through, or one of the people, that timeline, staying on that timeline, getting me drafts, those kinds of things, very helpful.
Thank you. Dr. Hurd.
Yeah, just quickly, I agree. For me, it was start early. I'm terrible at it. And so I always tell my mentees that's the thing. And also, as we talked about many times today, really by starting early, you can reach out to your program officer much earlier and get feedback from in that manner. Thank you.
And Dr. Campbell.
Yeah, I'll just say very briefly, just agree with everything that was said. But another reason to start early is that, especially if you're a basic researcher, or even if you're not, you actually get a lot of ideas about what additional studies need to be done to add to your preliminary data. You identify gaps right in the proposal with sufficient time to address them. So that's another reason to not procrastinate.
One last thing that I want to add is make sure that you have administrative support, right? That brings you from your application to the GCL to the NIH. Think about that early on. Don't wait until the last minute to find somebody who's going to go into the info ads, who's going to go into the system to put your application in.
Yeah, That's part of the timeline for people to understand. If you haven't done it before, there are so many steps you have to understand. We've tried to lay out a specific timeline. You just hand a document we put together. People written them, add to it. Hey, if I'd known this, this would be helpful. That's really helped our group by doing that. And then we have admin support that we provide, and you direct people to them. That's critical.
So I just wanted to thank you all for spending your hour with us today. This has been incredibly helpful. And any resources, Dr. Wright, I know you mentioned the Reach for Your R. If you have information about that or information about the CTSA that you think this is a generally clinical translational group. So we're happy to share any information that might be beneficial to folks. And thank you to our participants for coming. And we will, for any of you that want to come on Friday, we'll be here again on Friday, same time. So thank you, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Good luck with your applications.
Absolutely. Bye.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.